Welcome back everyone to the React In-Depth series. In this video, one of our final videos for the series, we're going to actually build a project for once. We're going to take everything that we've learned together in this series and put it all together into a nice, I hesitate to use a word, but complex, complicated, but mainly fun project that's going to be really having to use all the concepts that we've learned. We're going to have to make sure that we keep our wits about us as we go about this. The purpose of this is really to go kind of one step beyond all the exercises that we've been doing in the series together. The exercises have been, for the most part, relatively kind of compartmentalized to those concepts. And some of them, especially more recent ones, we've been kind of adding different things like different hooks and kind of mashing them together. But really, it's nice to be able to take all of these different things, the entire React kind of ecosystem and library that we have available to us, and actually build out a very large project and actually even add to it over time so we can show it off to others and really prove to ourselves that we know how to work with this library. The purpose of this project is to actually build a React router. So you may have used a React router package before or a library. I think one is actually called React Router. There's many that are built into different frameworks like Next.js and all the different like Svelte and things like that have their own routers. So we're going to build our own client-side routing library. I'm going to put that in air quotes because we're going to build a basic version and we're going to have a bunch of stretch goals where you can really start to add functionality and make it much closer to the actual thing that you might see coming down from something like NPM. So the purpose of this routing project is really, again, to build out a library so that we can use it inside of our projects. I was a bit hesitant when I was actually making this first because I actually wanted to make like a traditional, like a Pokedex or some kind of front-end application as we were building out this project together. I might do that as a second project after this, depending on kind of how this one goes. But I really wanted something that was a bit kind of out of the ordinary and something that would really stretch our kind of mental muscles in a way that building kind of something like a Pokedex, for example, might not, because we're going to have to deal with the inner workings of a lot of these things and actually start to think about things like API design. So enough of me yapping. I have some slides prepared. Let me just kind of go through them and we'll actually start building this out together. And hopefully this video doesn't go too crazy long. All right. So to start, as I mentioned, we're going to build our own React router. And this is going to be a client-side routing library that we're going to be able to use in our projects if we want to. The purpose of this is to have absolutely no external dependencies. And what I mean by that is that we're not going to be allowed, at least for our version of this project that we're going to be coding together, to use any external libraries like npm install, except for just React itself. So we're allowed all the hooks in React and all the stuff that we've learned throughout the series together, but we're not obviously allowed to do things like import React router or other types of libraries that might make things a bit easier. We're going to make sure that we kind of go as vanilla as we can to really stretch our React muscles. So that's really the purpose of this, is to use and practice all that React has to offer. A nice thing that we can do with something like a library is we can extend and we can even add it to our own project. So I probably wouldn't recommend that with the most basic version of this router that we end up building together, because the real quote unquote version that you might get on something like NPM is going to have a lot of kind of built-in error handling and a lot of built-in caching and things like that to make it a little bit more performant. However, you definitely could. And in fact, frankly, if you could show this off to someone or even in an interview or something like that, it would be very, very impressive if it's something that you built yourself, because it's one thing to use a tool that someone else built and actually show it off. And it's something totally different to just literally build it from build it from scratch yourself and explain it to someone. That goes really, really far to show your technical understanding. So really, I wanted something that you can add to your portfolio and be proud of it being onto your portfolio, and a little bit different than what you might see out there that really focuses on a lot of the front end stuff. For example, the styling of something and all that kind of stuff. You can definitely learn and do that. However, if you can do something like this where you build a library on top of React, it really shows that you kind of understand the internal workings and mechanisms of how React works, and you can do things like debug things if they go wrong much quicker and easier than if you were to just try to use the tool and build a front-end project. I encourage a front-end project on top of this. Maybe we'll do a video on that later, like a Pokedex, but I would like to focus on this one for now. So let me show you what our goal is for this project. This is kind of the goal. All right, so not a bit anticlimactic, but there's one thing that's kind of missing in here, but I'll mention that. If you've used something like React Router DOM or things like that, you've probably seen this kind of structure before. So let me just kind of go through it really quick, just so we're all on the same page. We're going to build a router. Okay, so that's kind of what I have wrapped around all this stuff. And the purpose of this router is to have routes, hence the name router. And that route is going to point to a specific URL. So for example, here I have like /1, right? The purpose of this router is to make it so that if our URL in our browser switches to /1 at any point in time, we will show the code inside of this route. So in this case, the components that are inside of this route. So we're going to mount those into the DOM as soon as the browser URL changes to match this path. Now, there's a lot of kind of trickery that's going to go on, and you can go really down a rabbit hole. So I'm going to try to zoom out a little bit and give you some tips in a second. But that's really the premise of this. It's to show that, for example, let's say I have my web page localhost and I go to /1, I would want to see this p tag. If I go to /2, I would no longer see this p tag right here. I would see this p tag here along with my woof components that I have in there, whatever happens to be in there. So we should be able to nest multiple components and subcomponents inside of these routes, just as you would expect. And over here, for example, this is route 3, and you can just create as many routes as you want with different paths, for example, a blog route or a profile route or a home route, and then those would mount the appropriate component depending on which page you're on. And we could even have things that display all the time, irregardless of which route you're on, by putting them out here inside of the actual router itself, outside of any particular route, for example. Now, this is just one way to approach this problem. I wanted to keep it relatively simple. My brain kind of went with this API style as I was building this, and I modified some small things as I was building this out for this project, just to make it as simple as possible for us to actually rationalize as we're going through the different components, because you can really start to go down some rabbit holes once you start trying to add too much extra stuff into this. But I'll mention some of those rabbit holes later that you can definitely go down once you have the base project built, but focus on building this API design. Now, there is an extra component in here that I haven't mentioned. So let me show you what I mean. Our goal for this project is to build 3 components, not the 2 that I just mentioned. So the 2 I mentioned were BrowserRouter, which is what wraps all the routes and all the components for our application. We're building in a route component, and that is the one that I just showed you right here, right, which has a path and that we pass in as a path, and then we can pass in different components as children, and those are going to be mounted or rendered depending on if the path matches. And then we also have a link, which I'm not showing here. And the purpose of this, and I'm going to leave this a bit out just to give you a bit of some thinking to do, is that the purpose of the link is that if you think of an A tag by default, what an A tag does is it makes it so that when you click on it, the browser kind of refreshes the page and it goes over to a new page totally by refreshing everything. So the problem with that is that we're creating a client-side router that's routing for what's called a single page application, which means that we're not allowed to have our browser refresh, because when the browser refreshes, it actually wipes out all the state in our app. So we want to actually control the state and actually intercept those navigation links so that we can kind of do some trickery and look like we're navigating between the links and the URL is changing, but there's no actual refresh happening behind the scenes. We're actually manipulating that ourselves inside of our router framework so that we can actually move between different URLs and pages. So it looks as if that's happening, but there's no actual refresh, so that we keep our state behind the scenes. So the purpose again is to build a router which wraps all of the routes. The routes tell the router whether to render the children depending on the path prop that we pass in. The link, the purpose of the link, and I'll show you another slide in a second that explains this a bit more deeply, is to really intercept those clicks. So we replace all of our A tags in our application with this link so that we don't actually trigger that refresh. Okay, so here's kind of a bit more detail on each of those. So let's go through these one at a time, because this is definitely going to help you out as you build this application. So our browser router is going to look like this. Let's go through these one at a time. We're going to have a browser router, and it's going to wrap all of our routes. So we should have all the routes inside the browser router. Okay. If a route is outside the router, it's not going to work. In fact, we should probably throw an error if we try to use a route outside of the router for reasons that we will see as we build this thing together. Now, what's the purpose of this browser router? Well, it's to store the context for the application that needs routing. So we're going to store some kind of state and context inside of our browser router that we can share with any of the children inside of there if they need it and if they need access to it, so they can tell kind of where they are in this tree of URLs that's being shared with them. Now, the purpose of each route is to take a path prop, and that path prop is going to conditionally render the children inside of it, depending on the path that it is inside of the global kind of router context. Okay. So for example, in this case, if we were at like localhost / blog, for example, we would be rendering these two components, our h1 as well as our blog component inside of there. Now, how do we navigate between the different routes? As I mentioned, we should not be using A tags because A tags by default refresh the page, which would eliminate any state and context that we might have in our browser router. So we need to actually create a custom component that is effectively a wrapper around an A tag that makes it so that when we click it, we don't do the default behavior and we actually can change state manually depending on how we set up our application. So the purpose, for example, in this case is if I created this, imagine that this is an A tag. I just replaced the href with a 2 just to make it very distinct from an A tag, but you can use href if you like. And this is going to say, when I click on this link, this blog, it's going to take me to /blog. And then what's going to happen is I would then display this route depending on what's in there. In this case, the h1 and the blog, because the browser router would know that I have switched to /blog. Okay, so that's really the purpose of this entire application, is to build out these three components so that they interact with each other in this particular way. In fact, I'll tell you right now that it's actually not that much code. The amount of code that you're going to be writing to build a very base version of this is much less than you would imagine. In fact, you could probably even fit it almost on one screen if you really tried to, for all three of these components. Now, that seems like it doesn't really make up a project, but the challenging part is how these interact with each other and designing it in such a way that it actually works properly with kind of the browser system as well. Okay, so I'll go into some tips next. I'll kind of mention that if you do want to pause the video and just kind of run with what I just gave you right now and try it, feel free to do that and pause the video and kind of look at the tips a bit later. I won't be giving the exact answer in the tips, but I'll be giving you some technical details as to how maybe you could look up things that might help you quite a lot if you do get stuck. So if you want to try that first, give it a shot, and then we'll go through some tips. Okay, so I'll start with just some really high-level tips, so non-technical tips to start, and this will be for any project. This is just general project tips to make sure that you don't kind of go too down the rabbit hole on certain things. I would advise you to draw this out, like literally draw it out on paper if you have paper, or on some kind of software program if you prefer that. And kind of visualize it. Try to picture different scenarios. Like take kind of this example and draw out certain other examples of this and try to think, okay, what would happen in this case? What would happen in that case? And how could I break it, right? What would be some things that might be an issue that might come up? Where do I need to store information? What doesn't need information itself? What can get it from somewhere else? Try to draw these relationships out. It really, really helps a lot. Another thing to keep in mind is try to work on one feature at a time. It's very tempting to try to build out everything at once. You kind of want to not test anything and build out all the features and make sure that they all work together right away, kind of thing. So that's kind of a recipe for disaster. What you really want to start doing is embracing kind of the incremental approach to building this and any project. You want to just do the basic stuff to make sure it works. Make sure your state is logging out. Make sure the objects that you're using are what you think they are. Make sure that when you click something, maybe something logs out or something happens, right? You don't need to make the entire application work the first time. In fact, it's pretty much impossible to do that as a developer for larger projects and even for smaller ones like this. And this is a very important one as well. Don't refactor or modify, like try to optimize or clean up your code until you're done the base application. This is super crucial. If you try to do this as you're going through the project, and I'm guilty of this all the time as well, what you end up doing is sometimes you end up just wasting time because you might throw it away anyways, but also what usually happens is when you're writing code for a larger project like this, your brain is kind of working in a particular way and you're kind of spitting out what's in your brain onto the screen. And usually the optimal code doesn't actually look like how your brain would normally think of the code. You'd have to sit there and literally think of how to optimize it as a separate project almost. So I would encourage you to kind of have a bit of spaghetti code, which means kind of just like throw the code on the screen, see if it works. Once it works, just kind of celebrate for yourself. And then you can kind of look at how you can add features and refactor it after you're done that. Now, one really important point I want to mention is that you absolutely will get frustrated and I forgot to put a D here, and you'll get lost and want to give up when you are working on this project. I'll tell you something. Even as I was building this, I think I mentioned at the start of the video, I was kind of like, oh, like, is this going to be too hard for people? Like, even I messed up so many times, to be completely honest, while I was building this thing, and some things weren't working as I expected them to work. And I actually ended up having to change some of the code around and actually did refactor it because my first implementation was pretty awful. And actually had some bugs. So you'll get frustrated, okay? And you're gonna feel lost. You're gonna want to give up. But I think the most important thing is to realize that that's the point, right? Imagine if I, as I was building this project, I gave up on it and I said, no, I don't think that this makes sense. I don't want to continue this because it's not going to work. It's too complicated. Then I wouldn't be making this video, first of all, and then none of you would have a chance to actually try this yourself and feel that, and then feel proud that you actually built something, and it would just be a total disaster. So I told myself, no, I need to finish this. I need to make sure that it looks good and it makes sense and it's easy to explain, so that everybody can have that experience as well. And then I can go in and I can clean it up and refactor it and make changes and add features later on. Even if a lot of stuff is broken to start, it doesn't matter. The fundamental concepts actually work. So that basically leads to my next point, which is that once you do finally have it working, or even parts of it working, honestly, like even small parts, celebrate, because that is going to feel really nice. Success feels really sweet when you go through the pain of having things not work over and over again. And you'll build some muscle memory for kind of real world development, because that's how it works when you're working on a team as well. Nothing's going to work pretty much the first time, or very rarely will it work the first time. You're going to have to try it a bunch of times. And even then you might have some bugs and you're going to have to fix them. And it's just going to be a continuous improvement process. But then you can tell everyone about it. Honestly, that was kind of the main point of me building this as a library for this project instead of just a regular front-end application, because it's much more impressive to be able to talk through how you built this library and some of the issues that arose as you're building it, so that, for example, in an interview or when you're talking with other developers, you can explain to them kind of some of the struggles that you went through and how you came out the other end and saw the light at the end of the tunnel, per se. Yeah, keep those in mind. It's very, very important. And the most important tip I can give you, honestly, is the one I have here at the bottom, but definitely not last. Last but not least, I think is saying, have fun, right? Like just have fun with this project. It's meant to be a technical challenge, but it's also meant to be fun. If you're not having fun, take a break, do something else, and come back. You're gonna get frustrated. It's gonna be very annoying at times. You're gonna get lost and confused. But just kind of take a break, reset yourself, and then come back and keep working on it so that you can actually eventually have something incrementally to show for it. All right, so what I have next are some technical tips, and these are gonna start giving away, not really giving away, but kind of pushing you in some directions that might help quite a bit, so that you can actually kind of get a bit of a jump start on this project. Now, the browser router that surrounds the entire application, the idea is to probably store some kind of context and stateful information in there so you can share it with all the routes and all the links if they need it. Now, the challenging part here, and I think I forgot to mention this earlier, is you're going to need to be able to support the back and forward buttons. Okay, this sounds relatively trivial, but it's actually not. There's a browser API called the History Web API, and you can look this up on MDN, that actually gives you a bunch of information, probably more than you ever want, as to how to actually handle the back and forward buttons and the different things you would need to actually make sure that that works. So I'd encourage you to look that up, because you're going to want to make sure that you have that working. Otherwise, the back and forward buttons are not going to work as you expect, and it's going to actually break your router. And we would want to support them because that's kind of page navigation, and that's how a lot of people would expect it to work. The other thing I'd encourage you to look up on MDN is the URL Web API. This handles URLs much more efficiently and easily, so you don't have to parse strings and things like that. It actually takes a URL and it kind of splits it apart into all its requisite parts. So I'd encourage you to use that. That was also another point of actually building a project like this, is to get more familiarity with some of the standard web APIs that are available to us in the browser. Now, you're going to also need to reach outside React to do many of these tasks. And keep in mind that that's what a side effect is, and that's what the purpose of things like effects and the use effect hook are. So definitely keep that in mind as you're building this project. And test out everything that you have with simple test cases and add complexity as you build. So like I said previously, don't try to build everything at once. Build everything incrementally and test it out. Add a little feature here, add a little extra thing, make sure it works as you expect, and then keep moving on from there. Okay. So before we get into building this and I show you some notes as to how I got started, I want to share some stretch goals with you. And this is something you can probably come back to later after you're done the project, and some things you can think about even as you're building the project if you like. These are things that maybe you can build into the router after you're actually completed the base functionality. So don't try to do these things right away. In fact, during this video, we're not going to handle these things. These are things I encourage you to try to get more practice on your own. So things like, for example, looking at the actual React router documentation itself for that NPM package. I think they have a nice website. They have some documentation. Try to look at some of the props they pass around, how they structure the components. What are some extra features that you can have an idea of just by looking at that? Here are some examples. Maybe you could handle query or search parameters in the URL. So for example, if we have /contact and then a query parameter or search parameters like this with a question mark, we would want to make sure that we can maybe eventually support that, because that's a valuable feature and there's a reason we put those in there in a URL, and we wouldn't want that just to break our routing. So for example, we would still want this to probably route to the contact page. It shouldn't just break and not go to the contact page in this case, because this is a valid URL to go to the contact page. You'd also probably want to see how you can handle things like hashes. If you've seen these before, you know that you can add a hashtag to an anchor tag, and that will kind of like scroll you down to that section of an ID inside of a web page. So for example, if something had an ID of header 2 on the hi page, this would take me directly to that spot on the page. You can see how maybe you could support that. That would be an extra nice feature to have. Also, I mentioned that this is a single page application. So you want to not only handle the internal links and routes, but you want to be able to figure out how you can also link externally. So an external link is probably going to need either a new tab or a page reload or something. So that needs to be handled differently than an internal link. You'd also want to see how maybe you can handle errors or even add a 404 page by default. Or something that the user can actually, of the library can actually change easily when it does come to these errors or these 404 pages. And most of all, I think the important thing is if you do end up using this in your project, that would be a nice way to actually battle test it to make sure that it actually works correctly as you expect. And you can even customize it for your own project and actually add the features that you specifically might need, and you can get rid of everything else. There are many, many more stretch goals that you could probably add and imagine adding for yourself. This is just a list of a few to kind of get your brain juices flowing and start to think about some things that you could have fun with. But I encourage you to try out a couple of these once you've done the actual project to actually get more practice if you like. All right, so that was a lot of me yapping, but hopefully that sets you up pretty well for the project. What I'll do is I'll give you a chance to go through that, and then I will actually build this myself with you watching, and I'll go through some kind of things that came up, and I do have some notes, and I'll go through those as well really quick. Okay. So some notes. This is a bit of kind of what I wrote down as my notes. Let me just kind of go through this before we actually start writing some code together, because it's really important, as I mentioned, to start visualizing and writing down on paper some of how you actually would approach this. What I actually did as well is I actually wrote like the code like on paper to see how I would want this to work. That sounds like a pretty intense thing to do, but it's a valuable thing. I encourage you to try it here and there with things like components and props and the API that you need to use for them to see if it makes sense. Like it should feel like it makes sense. It shouldn't feel like you're battling against the library that you're trying to build. So we have a browser router, we have a route, and we have a link. Okay, that was kind of the point of this project. So let's start with browser router. The browser router, I was thinking it's going to have a context, and I want that context probably to be a stateful context. And it's going to store information about the URL that we're looking at. Okay. Now, I also looked up the history API, and I saw that the main way to kind of handle things like the back and forward button are through not only the history API, but listening for events based on those events happening. So when you click the back button or you click the forward button, an event gets fired off in the DOM, and we can actually latch onto that event and do something to route our application. So I was thinking that it makes sense to set those all up in there. One thing I initially did actually was I didn't have a browser router at all, and I put everything inside routes. So each individual route had like event listeners and had its state information and all that kind of stuff. And it kind of worked a little bit, and I did some eventing, but it felt really kind of clunky. And I realized that very quickly that there would be a lot of event listeners, which is generally not a good idea. And in this kind of model that we're building, we have one event listener or a couple, depending on what events we're listening for, but we can put those all in one place. And then these are all just going to be, setting state or using those events depending on certain things that may or may not be happening, or firing off events, for example. So that's the browser router. The browser router can have many different routes inside of it, right? It can have 0 or many routes. And each route, the point really of the route, if you think about it, like if we go back to this, what's the point of this route? The point is to tell the router to render these children depending on the path matching the current route. That's literally the only point, right? So we're going to conditionally render the children based on some state that's being stored in the browser router. So I was thinking maybe we can use like use context or something. If we're using context up here, we can pass it down to all the routes, and then each route can actually figure out if it can get it from the browser router and then render itself depending on what's in there or not. We also know that we can have one or many links inside of our different routes, inside of the components inside of our routes. And the purpose of the link, we know, is to wrap the A tag so that we don't do the default behavior of reloading the page, and have an on-click event on there that gets kind of hijacked, and we can do our own setting state or using context or whatever it happens to be. So some other notes that I wrote were that it's really important to have kind of a central state of truth. I think I meant to say central source of truth that is a stateful source of truth. And that's kind of the intention behind this structure, right? We have a browser router, and that is kind of storing the truth, like the true state of our current routing of our application. So that is going to dictate what our routes and what our links have access to, because this is the only place where it kind of knows at a high level what is actually happening with those routes. So we want really as minimal global state as possible. You should really strive to not have too much of it, because it does complicate kind of things like re-rendering and just being able to change it from multiple different places. So all I did was start with being able to store a string. And then I changed that over time to be a URL object, because I found that a little bit easier to work with, because the string had some challenges to parse with. And I realized that the URL library actually just does that already for us. And I'll show you what I mean when we actually build this. We definitely want to strive for some simple components and an API. And when I say API, I mean the API for our library, right? So we like, this is our API right here. It's a browser router. It can have routes, and each route can have a path prop, and we'll see our link can have a to prop, right? So it's a pretty simple concept to wrap your mind around. There's nothing too fancy going on here. It just kind of makes sense once you look at it. You're like, okay, I want to go here, and then this kind of takes me there. And as long as it's inside of here, it should just work, right? So that's almost as simple as you can get. So we also need a way to handle this back and forward button, which I mentioned earlier, and then handle nested components. So for example, down here, you can see that path number 2 has a p tag and then the woof component as well in there. So we should be able to handle multiple children inside of our routes. All right. So hopefully that gives us a good setup. What I'll do now is I'll actually go over to VS Code and we'll actually start coding this out together. So I'll open up VS Code. I have a project open here. I'm just going to run npm create. I'm going to use Vite at latest to bootstrap my React application. I'm going to name this React-router. And I'll use React and I'll use JavaScript. And I'll change into my React router folder. I'm going to run npm install. While that's installing, I'm going to come over here and I'm going to open up some pages here. So I have my main page. I'll just get rid of the default styling here, the index.css. I don't really want that in there. You know what? Maybe I'll just keep app. Why not? I'll just keep app in there. Inside of app, I'll just kind of get rid of everything and keep it super simple. So I'll just get rid of all this stuff. I'll get rid of all this stuff. And I'll just like return, I'll just return a simple h1, and I'll just say app. Make sure that that actually works. So my npm install is done running. I'm going to run npm run dev, and I'll get my local dev URL right here. I'll just copy that. I'll switch over to Chrome. I'll create a new tab and I'll paste that in. And there we go. There's our app. And I'll open my console here because I know I'm going to be using that quite a lot. And there we go. So that's all set up. So I'll just close my terminal here because I want as much space as possible to actually focus on the code. All right. So to start, I'm just going to try to think back to my notes here. So this sometimes is really the hardest part, is kind of like, where do I even start? Where do I begin? So we know that we have 3 files. And how do I know it was 3 files? Well, well, that's kind of the purpose of the project. I'm kind of telling you that we need these 3 files. In reality, you would eventually probably come to this kind of setup as you're building things out, because you'd realize you'd need these more, you'd need more things as you're building it out. So for example, you'd realize you probably need a link because the a tag by default is going to refresh the page and change all your states. You could probably get away without this router, browser router, but you'd eventually probably want to store state somewhere and share it with everyone. So you'd eventually probably at least come up with something like this, but maybe it would be a little bit different. But I found this the easiest to go with. So this is kind of what we're going to build. So let's build a browser router, a route, and a link component. To start, I'm just going to put all of my components in the source folder, and then I can deal with organization and all that kind of stuff later, just so we don't have to worry too much about all that. So I'm going to say browser router.jsx. This is going to be a function, browser router, and I'm going to return the, this is export default browser router, and the return is up there. And for now, I'll just return, let's just do a fragment, just like that. And I'll do the same thing for my route.jsx. And I'll say function route, and I'll say export default route, and I'll just return some fragment. And then last thing here, I'll create a link.jsx, and inside my link, I'm going to do function a link. And these are going to take some props eventually, so I'm going to have to add those as I go, but we'll just start really simple. Return a link. No, return fragment. Okay, there we go. Okay, so that's pretty much what we have as a setup. So we have these 3 files. And I'll close my main here, and I'll leave these 3 open just so I can use app as well. The next thing I am going to do is try to figure out how I can deal with my context. So I'm going to come up here, and my goal with this is to figure out how to set this up. I want to figure out how can I store just enough state to share with kind of all of the different components in this application if they need it, but not in a dangerous way. I just want to share kind of the basic version of the state. Now, when I built this, there was a lot of, I had to also think of what would be easiest as I'm making this video and as a starter project. So by no means is this like a production API. This is just a starting point, and there are some good practices in here that you could carry forward. And there's some things that you'd probably also want to change or remove to make it a bit more optimal or safe to use. So let's just start with this, and I'll show you what I mean. So I know that I want a context. And how do I know that? Because I know that if we kind of go back to our goal, every single component inside here is going to need to know the current route, right? That sounds kind of obvious, but hopefully that kind of makes sense, right? Like, I need to know which route I am on as a component so that I can decide whether I should mount this one, or I should mount this one, or I should mount this one, right? So each route is responsible for knowing whether its children, in this case, get rendered or not rendered. Okay, so yeah, that's pretty much where we'll start. So we're gonna have a context, and I chose context because I want to be able to share this deeply into a tree of components. For example, if there's route or if there's link, I don't need to know where it is in my React tree. It can just have access to that context. So I'm going to import create context from React, and I'm going to create a context. So I'll say const browser context is equal to create context. And I also like to create initial states. Whether we actually end up using this or not, we'll add in the future depending on how you design things. But I'll just say const, I'll just say router state. And this can be, for example, an object. Okay, great. Okay, so that's pretty nice. Now, what I normally would want to do is I want to return this context so that I can kind of wrap all the children inside of this context. So if we look at this setup right here, what we're doing is we're passing a bunch of children to the browser router. That's kind of how it's wrapping everything. So actually what's happening is our browser router is going to get a children prop. And if you haven't seen this before, we looked at this in some of the videos in the series together, but we get this by default from React, which is going to be a list of all the children if they are being passed in from the parent. So what we'd want to do is we want to kind of render those inside here, right? We'd want to put the children in here. If we're given children for this browser, which means that if it looks like this, where we are given children, we would want to basically copy and paste those into that slot so that they actually get rendered out properly. So that's step one. Now, we're going to see this quite a lot. We're probably going to need this elsewhere as well, for example, with the actual route, because if you look at this, the actual route is going to take some children as well, and it's going to need to render its children depending on whether the path matches or not. So we'll probably need that as well. But until then, let's just deal with the browser router. So coming up here, what am I going to do with this context? Well, I'm going to pass this context here, and I'm going to grab the provider of that context. We know that we need to wrap the return value in the provider, and the provider is what allows us to pass everything inside of the brackets here. In this case, all the children are going to have access to the provider's context. So the context for the provider in this case is going to be what? Well, let's start with this. I'll just pass in a value. I know this is going off the screen, so I'll reformat in a second. And I'll just give it the router state to start. Okay. we're going to change this like almost right away, but just so that we can see how this works, that's going to be the setup pretty much for our browser router to start. It's going to have a context, it's going to be a provider, and it's going to render out the children with that value for that context where we can use and consume through the use context hook. Okay, now this doesn't actually work for us because if we think about this for a second, we're passing through a router state, and this is just a static value. So what we really want is a stateful value that we can pass through, because we want to make it so that when you change that state, the browser context can notify basically all the children that need that new state so that it can actually have that updated value. We want to be able to store a URL as state inside of our provider, but be a stateful value along with the set state function. So what I'll do here is I'll create that right over here. So I'll say const, and I'm going to end up using the use state hook. So this is the use state hook. Now, one just note here is you could probably think about reaching out for a use reducer hook. And I would say that's probably the correct way to do this, actually. If you're building this in kind of a larger context, no pun intended. But just to start, I'm just going to use useState to keep things as simple as possible. And in the future, the reducer would be something I'd reach out for as I'm refactoring the code. So again, don't refactor as you're going. Do it kind of towards the end, or if you really feel you need to when you're running against roadblocks. So I'm going to say, this is the current URL, and I'm going to say set current URL. This is equal to use state, and we're going to pass it some value. Now, this is where things get tricky. Do we pass it null? Does that make sense? Well, I don't know. Let's think. What is the purpose of this state? Well, what I want to be able to do is I want to be able to pass in as a value to this provider. I'll do it right now just so we can see. I'm gonna make this an object. I'm gonna pass in router state. I'm gonna pass in the current URL and set current URL, just like that. Okay, and any child of our browser context has access to this object, has access to current URL, and has access to change that URL statefully so that everything gets re-rendered. Now, initially what I did was I did a string here for the state. Okay, I did a specific string, and I'll show you the one I'm talking about shortly. But what I changed it to over time was the URL object. So let me show you what I mean. I'll come to my browser window here, and I have my terminal open. So let me just zoom in a little bit more on that so we can see. What we're trying to do, and this is a bit small, so apologies for the UI here. This is the URL that I'm trying to look at right there is localhost : and the port number. I want to be able to access that, right? So how do I access the URL from JavaScript? Well, that comes from the window object. So if I go to Google and I'll say access URL from JavaScript, let's see what we get. We can see that there's some answers over here, accessing the href property on the location object, window.location.href. Okay, that sounds pretty good. There's some Stack Overflow links. I don't see any MDN links. So you know what, I'll just test this out, window.location.something. So let's try that out. That sounds pretty nice. I'm going to say window in my terminal, or my console, sorry, for my Chrome DevTools. So window is this object right here. And we can see that there's a whole bunch of things in here. And this is only available in the browser. Window, Q, LMNO, P, LMNO. Wow, there's a lot of O's there. There's location, window.location. And inside of location, it looks like we have a whole bunch of stuff. So you know what, let me just make this a bit easier to see. What I'll say is window.location, and I'll grab that directly. And we get back this location object. And that location object has all these values inside of it. So that looks pretty nice, actually, right? If you look at this, we have some pretty cool stuff already. We have a host, we have a host name, we have the href, which looks to be like the entire URL. We have an origin, which we could probably use later. We even have a path name, and then a port and a protocol. Wow, that's pretty useful. We even have search down here, so that's pretty good. So we could probably set it to be something like this href, for example, right? Now, that's what I initially did, but what I eventually ended up doing was changing that and wrapping it in a URL object. Okay, so let me show you what I mean. I'm going to go to mdn URL, and this is the web API for a URL. I'm going to go to that link, and we can see that if I zoom in a whole bunch here, URL is an interface to parse, construct, normalize, and encode URLs. It works by providing properties which allow you to easily read and modify components of a URL. So that sounds kind of useful as a router, right? To be able to parse, construct, normalize, and encode URLs. That would be something a router probably would need to do. So if we come in here, we can see that a URL has information like the hash, the host name, a lot of similar stuff as a location, but a little bit more detail in there and a few other nice methods. So what I propose we're going to do is I'm going to make a new URL object, and I'm going to pass it window.location.href. And I'm going to get back a URL object that allows me to get all of that information parsed out automatically. And this is going to make it much easier as our URLs get more complicated. For example, query parameters, search parameters, and just a whole bunch of different path names and things like that. It's going to make it much easier. For example, this has a search params, a section that makes it really nice to get those out. Most of the stuff here is the same as window.location. And just so that you can see what that is, window.location.href was just that property of the location object off a window, which was the full URL, just so that we can have that entire thing. So if I come up here and I do like, for example, /happy/hello, and then I do like question mark, and I do q equals 1, 2, 3 or something like that, that might be something that we eventually end up seeing. What I can do now is I can do window.location.href, and you can see that I get back that entire string. And if I do a new URL with window.location.href, what I'll do is I'll have that nicely parsed for me, right? I'll get back an object that is already parsed. So look at that. Right here, I have the path name, and that's being separated out from the port, which is being separated out from the search query. Even the search query, I get back a nice object, and it's not showing here right now, but I could get back the key value pairs in there, for example. I have things like the full href, just the origin, which we're going to be using. A lot of really neat, important stuff in there that would be nice to have in a router. So instead of just a string, long story short, is I'm going to put it as a URL object, and I'm actually going to start it as the current URL, just like that. So I want the starting value for my use state to be a new URL, and I'm going to pass in window.location.href, which is the full URL. This is going almost off the screen here, but I think you can see that on the video, so that should be fine. Okay, so what I'm saying here is when this component first gets dumped into the DOM, I would like to grab the window location href and parse it into a URL object and then put that into state. So current URL is that, and set current URL is going to have access to that if it wants to, and actually change that. Okay, so that's pretty useful. Is there better ways to do this? Probably. Is this one of the ways to do it? Absolutely. But this is a very, very good start. Okay. Now, what is the next thing that we're going to do? Well, we have a URL, and we have a way to kind of pass that URL around. We can probably think about dealing with the back and forward button. But for now, what I'll do is I'll actually just deal with the route. And we'll deal with that stuff later on. Because if we think about it right now, what the route is doing is it probably has enough information because it has access to context, which has this nice URL object in there to be able to tell, hey, do I need to actually show myself or mount myself into the DOM or not? So let's actually take a look at that. I'm going to go over to route. And inside of routes, what do I need to do? Well, I know that route is going to take a couple of things. Let me go back to our goal right here. The goal is for routes to be able to take a path prop as well as a bunch of children. Okay, so let's code that in. I want to be able to take just like the browser context, the children, right? But then also the path that gets passed in. Okay. So once I have that, well, what do I need to do then? Well, I want to figure out if I'm at that path. So I need to figure out, am I at the current URL? And if I am, then display myself, otherwise not, right? So yes, then render myself, and then no, render nothing, right? That's kind of the purpose of route, is to figure out, hey, where am I? And do I have to kind of show myself, or do I just hide in the background until I'm needed? So that's great. Let's think about for a second what is going to be needed for this to actually work. How do I tell if I'm at the current URL? Well, the path is not going to tell us that, right? The path that is being passed in as a prop is this value right here. That is a path that we need to render ourselves at if we are at that path, right? So what that means is if I am at, /happy/hello or /1 or /2, I need to render that component. So that's not what we need, because that's not going to change. That's going to be static, because that's the point of the router, is to only render this path if that route is currently in effect. So I'll switch back to here, and I know that I have the current URL, but it's not in this component. The current URL is actually being stored here in the context for my browser router. Okay. So what I can then do is use context, right, to get access to this context, which has these values being passed in. I really wish this would reformat with prettier, but I think I have to go a bit further off the screen. And this is an object that has these 3 values in there. Okay, I'm not really using router state right now. There's nothing in there, so that's probably setting it up for later. But I'm really most interested in this value right here, and probably soon the setting of the value. But for now, the router, if you think about it, this route doesn't need to set anything. It just needs to know, am I at that route, which means it needs read access to this value right here, current URL. And we're going to conditionally render based on that. So we need to export that context. So I'm going to come down here. I'm going to say export, and I'm going to export the browser context. Okay. Then inside of route, I'm going to import the browser context. Browser context. Not browser router, just browser context from the browser router file. And this is where organization of our files would probably be useful. We could have folders and all that kind of stuff to get these things working. But we'll deal with that probably later. We have our context, and in order to actually consume the context from a child or a client of that context, we need to use context, right? We need the hook use context, which comes from React. And this we just built right now, which is the context itself. So what we're going to say is I'm going to say const, and this is going to destructure an object, right? Because that is how I am returning this value right here is in an object. If this was an array, I would have to destructure an array, but this is an object. So I'm going to destructure out the object. And what do I need? Well, we just mentioned I need access to current URL. That's all I really need right now. I just need to know, am I at the current URL? So I'm going to grab that. From use context. So I'm going to say use context first. I'm going to pass it the browser context. And in here, I'm going to say current URL. Okay, you want to make sure that if you're doing destructuring like this, that you have this value right here, the exact values that are being passed in. You want to make sure you match those, otherwise the destructuring will be undefined. Okay. So that's pretty good. I have access to this URL, and you know what? Let's just get some logging going to see if this actually works as we intended it to work. So what I'll do is I'll just make this route for now. Let's just return an h1, and I'll just say route in here. Okay. And for fun, I'll also just put children. Why not? Let's just put the children in there, and I'll just say route. And what I'll do is I'll do a console.log of the current URL and the path as well that's being passed in. And I want to use this now, right? I need to figure out how to use this route and this context. We haven't done link yet, but we'll do that shortly. I'm going to use this inside of app, which is going to be kind of top level or the mounting point for my application. So I'm going to import my browser router, browser router from /browserrouter.jsx. So that's, I don't know why my autocomplete wasn't working there, but that should be good. And I also want to import my route from /route.jsx. Okay. These are components that I can use inside of this app. Okay. So what am I going to do? Well, I'm going to, underneath my app, I'll create my browser router, just like that. And now I can pass children into browser router, right? I can pass in the children prop, which gets set automatically when we pass in values inside of here. So I'll, just for fun, I'll just say, an H2, I'll say browser router, just like that. And I'll also now use a route. So I know that the route is going to look like that, and I can pass in children. And the route is going to take a prop. What prop is it going to take? It's going to take a path prop. So I'm going to say path, and I'll just put, let's just put /1 for now, just so it makes sense. And in here, I'll put an H1, and I'll just say route 1, not route 2, just so we don't get confused. Okay. Or I guess maybe I'll do H3, route 1. H3. There we go. And what that's going to do is I have an H1 in here, so it's going to be a bit weird, but I'm going to have route, and then I'm going to have H3 in here with my route 3. And I'm going to be able to do some logging here to see what is actually happening to make sure that works. So there's quite a bit going on already if you think about this, right? We have our browser router, which has some children. It has a single route in this case as a child. And that route has some children itself, and it has a prop to tell which path it's on, but we don't have any logic yet to display any conditional rendering. So it's just always going to display itself with this H1 and then the children that get passed in. Okay, so let me switch back to Chrome, and I'll just refresh the page, and we can see that that is indeed what we get. So it's actually working, right? So we get app, and app is coming from our app right here. That's our H1 right there. We have our browser router, which is coming from inside our browser router, which is being rendered from the browser router component. Then we have route and route 1. And if we come back here, that is coming from here. Route 1 is the child of route, and that's being placed below the route H1 right here in this case. So we can probably get rid of that because we probably want only dynamic data in here. But for now, that's totally fine. Okay, so that's actually working. Let's take a look at our log. So if we look at our log, we have over here kind of the number 1 as well as the object, right? So we're logging out current URL, and then we're logging out the path. And then recall that the path is coming from here. That's that prop right there. So the number 1 is the path. And that's what we're seeing right here. The string 1, sorry, is the path. And then that object is right here. That's that URL object. Okay, so that's pretty nice. And I still have all my happy hello and query parameters in there, so I'll get rid of that shortly. But that's actually working quite nicely, right? We have access to that information from our route. So our route knows this object. It has access to this object from the context. So what do we need to know? Well, imagine for a second, I'm going to switch this route. I'm going to go to /1. That's going to be the route I want to go to. I'll press enter, /1, and I'm going to get 1 as my path, which is the route path. And if I open up this object, I'm going to see that the path name is /1, right? That's the path name. In fact, what I should have done technically here is done /1, because that's the path that I want, because there could be other types of paths. So if I see /1 here, that's going to match my path name of /1. So this is really cool, right? Because this is also why I wanted to use a URL object, because I have access to the path name without having to worry about parsing it out of all this other host name and origin and search parameters and all that kind of stuff. So I can now check, am I currently as a route at this path name? And if I am at this path name, then I can show the JSX that I'm meant to show. Otherwise, I cannot show it. So let's see if that works. I'll come back to Chrome or VS Code, and I'll go to my route, and I want to do this part right here, the yes and the no. Am I at that URL? Yes. Render myself? No. Do nothing. So let's do that. I'm gonna put a maybe I'll just do if for now, just so we can do that. I'll say if the current URL. Remember, this is an object, right? This is an object coming from the context, and we from this object want the path name property. That's what we're looking for. If current URL dot path name is equal to the path that we are being requested to display at from our prop, then we want to return this. I'll get rid of route here in this case. I'll just put the children just so that it's a bit clearer, because now we're starting to have more routes soon. So if that is the case, then I'm going to return this right here. Else, I'm going to return something else. So what do I want to return in the case of not showing this path? Well, I'm just going to return null. Right? So if I'm currently at this path, then return the children for this route, right? Otherwise, don't return anything. So let's see if this works. I'm going to refresh the page, and I'm at route 1/1 here in the top. So it's very tiny, but I am at /1. And if I change this to /2, and I press enter, I expect browser router and route 1, I expect route 1 to disappear. Browser router is going to stay because that's in browser router. So route 1 is going to disappear. Let's see if that's true. And it does. It does disappear. So that's really nice, because what's happening right now is we're getting 2 as the path, and 2 is not equal to the current path name. So we're not going to return this. We're going to return the else. So we could actually probably conditionally shorten this. We could make this like a ternary or something. I'll just leave it at that for now, and we can fix it later if we need to. So that's pretty nice. I'm going to comment out that console log for now, and we can bring it back later if we need to. So actually, if you think about it, this route is looking pretty good, right? I think it's looking pretty good. If we think about it, I could probably say like we're pretty close to done this route, or probably done. This route just needs to know, am I at that URL? If I am, display my content, otherwise display nothing. That's literally the purpose of the route. It doesn't need to do anything. It's not setting the route. It's not changing it. It doesn't have any buttons to change anything. There could be other features we can add in here later, but at its core, the route just needs to know, am I to display or am I not to display? And that's exactly what we're doing here. This is I am going to display. The else is I'm not going to display. And we could turn that into a ternary or something shorter. Okay, so that's pretty nice. So let's make a couple of these and see if this works. So I'll go to my browser router, or sorry, I'll go to my app, and I'll make another route here. So I'll just kind of copy that down, and I'll make a /2 this time, and I'll say this is route 2, and we'll test if that works. And just to make this like more realistic, I'll just create another route here. I'll just call this I don't know. Blog.jsx, and I'll do function blog, and I'll return an h1, and this says blog, and I'll export default blog. Okay, so I have a component to use if I want to inside of my app. So I'm going to import blog. Import blog from /blog.jsx. You don't have to do this. It's just nice to see if we can get this working. So I want to be able to do this. I want to be able to render my route 2 and my blog at the second route. And if I switch to route 1, I should only see this route 1. That's kind of the purpose of this. And if I switch back to my browser, I was already at route 2. So it looks like that is working. So let me refresh the page here. I do get route 2 and blog. Notice I don't get route 1. Right, I don't get the children from this. If I switch to /1 here and press enter, I indeed go back to route 1, and I don't actually see my my route 2 and my blog. Okay, so that actually works quite nicely. And switch back here to 2, and there we go. I see my route 2 and my blog. So that's pretty good. I like that a lot. That is hopefully makes you happy when you see that, because it definitely makes me happy, because that is actually a big part of making this work. Is we have our context, we have the route, and then the route is able to conditionally render itself depending on which route it's at. Now, what doesn't work right now is if I go back and I go forward, well, in this case, it kind of is working. But what you'll notice is if I click back and I click forward and I click back, forward. So what's happening is there is a refresh of this page. And technically, if we're creating a multi-page application, that's okay. And our router is actually working correctly because it's grabbing stuff from the URL right away. But this would break our React application. If our React application relies on state, it would all get wiped out. And we don't want that to happen. We want all of our component states to get maintained as we navigate across the different URLs, because that's most of how single-page applications in React actually work. So we can fix that specific navigation behavior using the history API, which gives us access to listening to back and forward buttons. And I should say, we should also create our own version of a link. So let me show you what I mean by that. If I go to my VS Code here, and let me go to my route 1, and what I'll do is I'll create an A tag, and I'll say the href is /2, okay, and I'll say go to route 2, okay, and I'll refresh the page, and I'll go to route 1/1 here, and you can see I have a go to route 2 link, right? And if I click on that, what happens is it totally refreshes the page again, right? So I'll go back and I'll click on it, and it totally reloads that page, and any state I have will get erased. So same behavior that we want to eventually hopefully eliminate, depending on what kind of application you're building. In this case, a single page app, React kind of expects the states to be maintained, and we don't want to be like totally clobbering other contexts or other use states and reducers across our application, because that might break our application in various ways, at least for something that expects to be stateful in a single page way. So we have two kind of issues to fix. One is the back and forward buttons, right? And we have the link as well. And both are, one has to do, so the back and forward has to do with the browser's behavior, which is a history API. And this link has to do with us wrapping the actual link. So let's think for a second how we can, maybe we can tackle the back and forward to start, and then we can deal with the link right after. So for the back and forward buttons, what we're going to need to do is have access to those events that the browser is going to give us when the back and forward button get triggered. Okay, because if you think about it, there's no HTML component that we have access to that will kind of allow us to like intercept or check whether the back and forward button have been clicked, right? We just have regular buttons and links and things like that. So let me show you what I mean. If I go to Google and I'll go to MDN History API, this is the History Web API, and let me click on that. And before I show you this, you're probably thinking, hey Nader, that's great, but how would you know that you needed to come here, right? Like just like the URL, like how would you know that you need the History API? Well, when I was building this, and when you would be building this, you would realize pretty quickly that as you're clicking these buttons, you need a way to tell whether you're clicking back or forward, right? So I'd probably Google something like how to tell if I click back in the browser or forward in the browser in JavaScript. And eventually you'd land on a bunch of articles, just like we saw with this example here, that the History API is one of the main ways to do that, okay? So the history interface allows manipulation of the browser's session storage, that is the page visited in the tab or the frame that the current page is loaded in. There is only one instance of history. It's a singleton. You don't have to worry about that. It is a global object available on history. Okay, that's cool. So let's take a look at this. So I'll say history. All right, so there we go. Not much on there. Okay, is this really that helpful? Well, let's take a look. So I'll scroll down here, instance properties, length, storage, and state. Okay, maybe, I don't know if we would need this. This is talking about an event. Okay, this sounds kind of promising. Instance methods, we can trigger a back. We can trigger a forward. Okay, that's kind of cool. We can trigger a go and give it an index. It's pretty cool. There's a push state, pushes the given data onto the session history stack with a specified title, and if provided the URL, data is treated as opaque by the DOM. You may specify any JavaScript object that can be serialized. Note that all browsers but Safari currently ignore the title parameter. For more information, see Working with History API. So we can also replace state and push state. So if we kind of look over here, we can see that there's ways for us to navigate across the application with our back and forward buttons, and that's going to trigger some kind of event. And it looks like right down here in the bottom, let me zoom in a little bit more. In the bottom left, we have this thing called a pop state event. I'll click on that. Pop state event is an interface for the pop state event. Okay, great. Pop state event is dispatched to the window every single time the active history entry changes between the two history entries for the same document. If the history entry being activated was created by a call to history.pushState, okay, we just looked at that, so that's kind of interesting, or was affected by a call to replace state, so we also looked at that. The pop state event will contain a copy of that entry's state object. Okay, so it's an event, right? Cool. So we know that with events, we can listen to events. So I'm just going to click on this pop state event right here. Window.popStateEvent. It's going to be fired. We already looked at that a little bit. If history.pushState has been used, we can get access to that state on the stack. It uses the event name in methods add event listener, or use the event name in methods like add event listener or set an event handler property, add event listener, pop state. We get the event on pop state if we were doing it that way as well. Okay, so let's test this out. Let's see kind of what happens here. So I'll come to my VS Code, and I'm going to try out this event. I'm going to listen for it and see what happens if I listen for it. Now, the tricky thing is, where do I put this? If I want to listen for an event like this push state or pop state or whatever the event was, the place that probably makes the most sense to put this is as high as I can in my hierarchy. Originally, as I mentioned before, I put this event handler or event listener inside all of the routes. But then if you had like 100 routes, which is not an uncommon thing, we would have 100 event listeners, which is not a good design and very, it would bog down the browser's memory. So I'm going to put one event listener in the browser router, which is the context, and it's going to listen for all of these events and let the children know whether that has happened or not. So I need to actually use effect. I was going to say use event, but use effect, because this is a side effect. Anytime we're listening to events or adding event listeners, we need to make sure that we are using use effect. So I'm going to create a use effect here. And I want to make sure that this only runs when this browser router actually mounts. I don't want to keep making new event listeners every single time something re-renders. I want to make sure that this is only created the first time that this mounts into the DOM. So I'm going to say window, which is our main global window object, or we could do this on document, but I'll just say window.add event listener. And to our event listener, what we can do is listen for the pop state event. And in here, we're going to get access to that event, and then I can console.log that event. Okay. Maybe I'll create a function to handle that shortly. Actually, you know what? I'll do that. I'll do that. I'll call this function handle pop state event. And in here, what I'll do is I will get the event, and I will say console.log. You'll see why in a second. Console.log of the event. Okay. Now I'm going to pass that handle here. This is handle pop state event, and we know that with effects we need to remove the event listeners when it gets unmounted. Okay. Otherwise, we will have memory leaks in our application. So we can remove this by returning a cleanup function from our effect. So I'm going to say return, and this cleanup function is going to be called when this component gets unmounted. React is going to mount and unmount our component twice in dev mode to make sure that we're actually doing this correctly. But I'm going to say window.remove event listener. And this takes the event name, which is pop state, and it takes the handle to the function which we used. We can't, I couldn't have passed the anonymous function in here because an anonymous function is actually different, a different handle. So this is the same handle as this, and they're both pointing to this function. if I put an anonymous function in place, they would each be their own independent identity function. There'd be different IDs inside of JavaScript for that function, and we would not be removing the correct function. So just keep that in mind as well. So this effect is going to add that event listener and then remove it on unmount. And this is going to be mounted as soon as our browser router gets mounted into the DOM. All right, so let's switch back to Chrome here and take a look at what we have. So if I go back to my application, let's try this out. So our goal is to see if the back and forward button actually work. So I'm going to refresh the page. I think I have a little bit of history here. So I go forward and look at that. I get my pop state event logged out right here, BrowserRouter.jsx line 11. That's pretty cool. I go back. I get another pop state event. I go back. I get another pop state event. So that's actually working quite nicely. So I should mention something here before we keep going too far with this. When I was building this, I actually had quite a few issues with this pop state event. I believe MDN has a little bit of warning here about it not triggering and things like that. So you can take a look in there. But if you find that this is not working for you, it might actually be working. It just might not be like immediately working the way that you think it is. So I do want to show just a couple of cool things that you can do that are very useful just for general JavaScript debugging in the browser, in case you run into things like this, because this is kind of some of the steps that I went through to make sure I actually know like that this event actually is firing. Because initially what was happening was I was clicking back and forward and the event was not firing properly for me. So I was really confused. I thought my code was wrong, but it turned out to be actually like a separate issue. I haven't immediately figured out always how to fix this, but I'll show you what I mean. So if you're not seeing these events fire, let me show you something cool you can do. If you go to the Elements tab in Chrome, at least, it should be the same in a lot of other browsers. Let me just make this a little bit bigger here so we can take a look together. In the very bottom here, you can see that there's an Event Listeners tab, right? So I'll click on that one. And what this does is this lists out the different event listeners that we have on different parts of our application. So for example, if I come in here and I click on like different parts of my head doesn't really have events here. If I click on the div here for the root of the app, you can see that there's a bunch of events here. And this should be, I believe, React kind of overriding some of these and handling them in its own way. And if I had events here, we could actually see them separately. For example, if I was to click through these and add like an on click or something like that, that would probably be listed here. Now, we added our event, if we go back to VS Code, to the window. So it's not really on a particular DOM node. So that's kind of curious. So what does that actually mean and how can we actually see that? Well, we can actually go and tick this button. Again, I haven't tested this in all the browsers. I just want to show you the concept so you can kind of hunt around different browsers to see how you go about this. If you click on this Ancestors tab, what you'll see is that there's this is the ancestors of these elements, the different DOM or the different events that we can see there. We can see that popstate is on here, and popstate is actually on the window, and it's on browser router JSX line 10. So check this out. I'm going to show you something really, really cool. This is very handy for debugging some of these things if you run into issues. If I click on this browser router JSX line 10, it'll actually take me to the source code in my browser for that function. And that's right here. That's happening inside of React. Now, React is doing some nice things for us behind the scenes. With the dev server for Vite specifically to make sure this looks nice for us and it all translates properly so we can see the source and it's not compiled down. But at the end of the day, what we can actually do is we can actually set breakpoints if you've ever done it before in different programming languages, and you can actually test to see if your code is working the way that you expect it to work. So for example, if I put if I click here, I should be able to add a breakpoint on this line. And if I press forward, what we'll see is that it's actually paused my application on this line. And I can actually look at the different data in here. For example, there's a pop state event that's come through right there. And I can look at in the bottom here, all these different variables and the closure. There's a lot of very powerful things we can do. Could probably make an entire series on just this idea. And to unpause, I can click this unpause button right there, and I can remove that breakpoint by just clicking it again there. So some pretty cool stuff you can do to actually test that out. What you can also do is you can create events from the actual console here. So for example, I can do like I could dispatch an event. I can dispatch a new pop state event like that. And I would want to make sure to call it pop state. And in here, I would do just that actually, and I would close that off. So this is going to dispatch a new pop state event to the window, and we'll actually be able to see if that triggers our function. So if I run that, you'll see that we indeed get that pop state event log coming from our browser router console log on line 11 there, which is pretty nice. And that just returns true for the actual dispatch function. Another thing that we can do is we can do things like the history dot forward, for example, forward like that, and we can go forward, and that's going to take us forward and backwards in our history, and you can try triggering pop state events that way. You can also do, I think it's, what was it, pop state, or was it set push state, history.push state. You can try using that. We'll show that in a second in the actual code, but there's a whole bunch of cool stuff you can do in the browser to actually interact with your application and even debug it through the actual debugger console. So that's pretty cool. Just some tricks to see. You can test things out manually if things are not working for you right away in the actual browser. So if eventually it should work, I believe, once we actually start playing around with this more and adding more functionality. But just in case you do run into that and you are a bit stuck on those not triggering, even though their code is the same, don't worry, just keep going. And you can try these solutions, or you can just try until later on where hopefully I think you have to do things like interact with the DOM and a couple other things to actually allow modern browsers like Chrome or maybe even Firefox to let you hook into that event and do something with it. So a little bit of a side, but hopefully that is useful. Okay, so to kind of recap, what we did here was we hooked into that pop state event using our window event listener for pop state, and we're calling this function every single time that event happens. So that's that console log right there. So now in my console here, if I click backwards and I click forwards and I click backwards and forwards, you can see that we're actually not getting our reload anymore, which is really nice because we're hooking into that event. I'm actually kind of curious as to why we're not preventing the default and it's not reloading. I'll have to look into that. But suffice to say, we are hooking into this event and it's actually giving us the event which we can use if we need to. In this case, we're not actually going to use it. We are just going to do something in this particular life cycle for this event, which we'll see in a second. So let's kind of zoom out for a second and think as to how we landed here. We wanted to make sure that when you click on the actual browser's back and forward button, so for example, this is on your mobile phone or Firefox or Safari or Chrome, wherever it happens to be, it could be like if you have a fancy car, it could be in your car's browser back and forward button, or your fridges or whatever it happens to be. We want to make sure that we can handle that event and actually move the user back and forward between the different pages manually, right? Instead of having to refresh the page. So what does that mean for us in our application? What does it mean to actually move forwards and backwards between the pages? Well, what that means is we want to actually set the URLs to be something, right? And this was a little bit tricky to kind of to wrap your mind around. Even for me, when I was building this, I was like, oh, this is a little bit confusing. So I'm just going to put a note here. And I'm going to say I want to set the URL to be updated, or I want to update the URL, update the state of the URL. Because what's going to happen is this is going to trigger a back or a forward. The window location href here is going to change, right? Because we've already triggered that back or forward. And we can take that URL and set it to be the new URL. So every single route has an updated state for whether we went back or forward, depending on what that URL got changed to, right? So what do we want to do to set this URL? In fact, let's do it right now so we don't forget. What we want to do is we want to actually set the current URL. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to set the current URL. And what do I want to set it to? Well, I want to set it to the current window location. Actually, not too different from what we have right over here. Right, we have a new URL and we have window location.href. So let's do that. I'm just going to copy that. I'm going to say new URL window.location.href. Okay, so every time you click back or forward to go through backwards and forwards through the browser histories API, and cache, what you're going to do is we're going to set the current URL in our app for React, the state, to match what we're seeing in the actual browser toolbar. So now what's going to happen, I'll just clear this out. If I go back and I go forward and back, for example, let me try to go to route 2 here. I'll click on 2 and then I'll go back to 1, forward. Now I think I lost my state actually. Funny enough, speaking about that, my pop state is no longer showing up, and now it's sometimes showing up and not showing up. I think it has to do with I'll have to check what that has to do with. That's a bit confusing actually. Now I'm a bit confused, but that's what I was mentioning before happened to me. Sometimes the pop state was happening and sometimes it wasn't. It might actually do with my misunderstanding of the actual API. But suffice to say, we actually have this working now. We are setting the current URL of the application to always match what's being inside that window.location.href. So every time you click backwards and forwards, that is always in sync. So we don't need to worry about that backwards and forwards breaking our routing, because we want to make sure that the default browser behavior for back and forward actually does update this state correctly. And this is our way to effectively hook into the browser's back and forward button, no matter what browser you're using, as long as they implement this pop state history API, which most of them do, it should be totally fine. Okay. Now, believe it or not, we're actually pretty close to being done. And the only thing we really need now is to make it so that we can link around in our application nicely, and we can maybe even make a nav bar to test that out. So let's go over to link, and we'll start fixing some things in here, and then we'll actually test it with a new component maybe and see how we can actually move around our app. So our link, let's go back to my, my drawing here, and let's take a look at how this is going to work. So when we have our link, I mentioned that I wanted the API to look something like this. I wanted it to effectively look very similar to an A tag, an anchor tag. However, I wanted the href instead to be a to attribute, and that could be the relative URL inside of our domain. And then we can also pass in children, which are going to be, in this case, like some text, which would be you'd normally see inside an A tag. You could probably nest some things in here if you wanted to, but we'll just go with basic text to start. So we need to have a to prop, and we can have children as well. So let's code that out together. So in here, we're going to have our children and our to prop. So this is going to come from whatever is in between the brackets, and then to is going to be what we're going to be using for our on-click navigation. So what are we going to return? Well, I'm going to return an A tag. And inside of this A tag, I'm just going to put the children. Okay. And I'm going to make a function, and it's going to call, let's do a handle navigation. And what we're going to do is when you click on this A tag, it's going to take you to wherever the to prop is. So I'm going to say on click is going to go to handle navigation. And in here, what we're going to do is actually figure out how to get to this location. Okay, and that's kind of what we were seeing before. What we could do is we could set the window location directly. The problem with doing that, though, is if we set window location, it actually causes a reload of the browser. So what we really want to be doing is actually, we kind of already built it. We want to be using our state to set the current URL. So no matter where you are in the application, it just works, right? Because we know that set current URL is going to set this URL. And when we set that URL, it's going to update everything that's using that state. In this case, everything inside of this context, which is also happens to probably be using that state. Which means that when we look at things like our app, everything in between our browser router is going to get re-rendered with that new state, which is actually what we want, right? Because if I change to /1, I want everything to know that I've changed to /1, and I want to render those correct routes if they're matching. So let's get that working. We can access the context inside of link by using use context, and we also need to import the correct context. So I'm going to say import browser context from BrowserRouter.jsx. And I'm also going to import use context from React. Okay. Now, what I can then do in here is I can say const, and I'll grab the current URL equals. So that's destructuring it out of use context. And I'm going to use context of the browser context, just like that. Okay. Now every single link in our application is going to have access to that URL, which is quite nice. And it's, or actually, I should probably not say current URL. I actually want to do set current URL. So set current URL. There we go. I got too excited. We can set any URL from any link in our application, and it's going to change the context in the browser context to be that new URL and re-render every single route for us, which is quite nice. So what we can do in here is we can do set current URL, and we're going to set it. So the to property is going to, it's going to be a relative URL. Okay, so that's kind of one of the tricky things. What if we look at our, where is our browser router? Our state for our context for the current URL is a full URL object. Okay, so href, so if we do this, let me just go back to Chrome real quick. So if I say window.location.href, this is the full URL, including the HTTP, so the origin, the port, and the actual path name. However, what we're going to be passing to this link, just like we're passing to the routes, is window. It's going to look like this. This is not what we're passing in, but we're going to be passing in the path name, right? So we need to actually combine these two so that we're setting the new URL object for the current URL in the state for the context to be the correct thing. We can't make a new URL with that. So if I try to make a new URL with like /1, I'm going to get an error. But if I made a new URL with this, it would actually work correctly. So if I come back here and I go to my link, I'm going to set the current URL to be a new URL, and I need to give it a string for the URL. So that's going to be window.location and then .what. So I need to figure out inside here, what is it in a URL that I can have the things before the slash. So let's come back to Chrome here, and I'll just clear this out, and I'll say new URL for window.location.href. So that's what's in there right now. And we want to make sure that we have everything before the slash so that we can then just add it to the end. And that is going to be the origin right here. Okay, so that has the protocol, and it has the actual host name, and then it has the port as well. So if we take this and we concatenate our to, which is going to be the path name, we will have the full href for that URL. Okay, so I'm going to say window.location. What was it? I already forgot. .origin. There you go. Origin, and we're going to add the to. Okay, so that's going to take this that we're going to be passing in, and it's going to concatenate it to the origin, and we're going to have that as our URL. All right, so that's pretty nice. Let's kind of see if we can actually get this working. So I'm going to create a new file. I'll create navbar.jsx function navbar. And I need to import my link. So I'm gonna, did I export my link? I indeed did export it, so that's good. So I'm gonna import link from link, and I'll add the extension here. And in my navbar, what I'll do is I'll just return, in this case, let's do a, I'm so used to doing fragments, but I'll just do it. It probably looks strange, but I'll just do that. A nav, and then in here, I'm gonna say links. And I'm going to make 3 of these. Let's do one. We'll go to 2 equals. Did I? What am I doing here? Where? How did this nav get in there? That's really confusing. 2 equals, and I'll say let's go to / I don't know, home, and we'll say home. And I'll say this one is going to go to /blog, and this will say blog. And then this can go to equals, let's go /about, and then this can go to about. All right. And then we can export this. So I'll say export. Ooh, can't spell. Export default navbar. All right. Now what I'll do is import that into app, and we can test this out. So I'll say navbar import. I don't know my autocomplete is not working. So that's fine. So there we go, navbar.jsx. And what I'll do is I'll put this at the very top. So I'll say navbar right here, just like that. And if I reload the page, hopefully let's see what I get. Cannot destructure set current URL of use context as it is undefined. So let's take a look at that. If I go back to my browser router, I want to make sure I pass it in correctly. And I did, right? That's set current URL right there. So that's pretty nice. And then if I go to this is coming from my error, from my link on line 5, set current URL, use context, browser context, set current URL. So I don't have access to that from this context. So that's interesting. Let's see the error. It's undefined on that page. Error occurred at link. Cannot destructure from my use context. That's curious. Did I import the context correctly? I know I should probably be checking to see if it's undefined or not. But in theory, I should have access to it. Oh, I see why. So this is why errors are good. Actually, in this case, it's being correct. I didn't put my navbar inside of my browser router. So the context was not defined outside of the browser router. Okay, the context is right here in every child of this. So this is outside. It's probably confusing myself. So now I should have access to that context. And this is pretty not good looking because I have them right beside each other. I should probably add some spacing, but let's see what happens. If I click on home, I see nothing on the screen. I click on blog, nothing happens. I click on about, and nothing happens. So something is kind of happening here, because if I refresh the page, I have route 1 showing up here, but then when I click on one of these, something is changing the state to make sure that that original route here is not actually showing, but it's not showing what I kind of expect it to be, and it's not changing up here correctly either. So let's debug that a little bit. So this is the navbar. And I guess actually it is working actually, kind of. The only problem is it's not changing the URL, which is not ideal. So we'll fix that in a second. But what's happening here is we have route 1, we have route 2, and then we have no home or blog. So what I'll do is I'll change my route 2 to be /blog, and I'll change my route 1 to be home. And I'll get rid of this A tag because we're actually using links now. So I'll just comment that out, and I'll save the file. And now if I click on home, I get route 1. If I click on blog, I get route 2 and blog. If I click on about, I get nothing because there's nothing there right now for about. I click on home, back to home, blog, about. So that's actually quite nice. This is actually showing that our conditional rendering is working. Now there's some issues with this. If I click on forward or backward, it's not really going to work because the state for the browser history is not translating when we're clicking these. So we have to fix that. And then the actual URL is also not changing, which is kind of an issue because that's what's being used for the state. So what we can do is in our link, what we can say is that we can actually start manipulating the browser's history cache to actually change the URL around so that it actually matches what we have over here. So let's think of how we can do that. So if I come back to Chrome, this is kind of what I was saying before. The popstate event is fired and adds values to the history. We can use history.pushState to add a history entry to the history stack so that it can be used. So if I look at history.pushState, we can add an entry to the browser's session history stack. this method is asynchronous. We can add a listener for popstate. So we're already doing that in order to determine when the navigation has completed. So this is kind of interesting. Now we have a lot of things playing together here. That event listener that we just wrote for popstate is going to be listening for events that are going to be the popstate event. So it's saying here that if we run a push state method in one of our components, it's actually going to trigger the popstate event. So let's see how we can actually use this. So it's going to say push state, state unused, and then URL. So state is a state object. I'm not going to go too deep into this because you can actually push data back and forth. We're not going to be using this at all right now, so I'm not going to be passing in state. Unused is for historical reasons, as it says down here. The one that we're really interested in is the URL, which is the new history entries URL. So note that the browser won't attempt to load this URL after a call to push state, but it may attempt to load the URL later. So this is also a bit of asynchronous, confusing stuff that we have to be a bit careful for. And these are some of the edge cases that the real quote unquote libraries do handle. I'm not sure if all the routing libraries use kind of methods like this, or if they change if they've changed to use some other methods. They also have to support a lot more browsers. So there's a lot of these APIs that are not available for every single browser, for example. We can, most of the push state is supported pretty far back, but some of the other things are for super old browsers. And some of the new APIs like Navigate API and things like that are only available for very, very new browsers. So what we're going to try is a push state for the URL. And I'm going to try that over here. So I'm going to say window.history.push state. And I want to push some data. So traditionally, this is like an object or something. So I'll just put an empty object, unused string. I'll just put null. Technically it's supposed to be a string. So I'll just give it an empty string. And URL, this is the thing that we're interested in. This is our to, which is this to right here, the relative URL that we are pushing to. Okay, so that is, let me show you right here in our nav bar, just so that we're on the same page. That is this relative URL right here. So what we're doing is every time this link is clicked, we want to run this function to set up the history so that the back and forward button works, and we trigger that pop state. And we want to set the context URL to match the actual window location plus this new URL. So let's see what this does for us if I go back to Chrome. And I'll go back to my application, I'll refresh the page, and then I'll click on Home. So Home takes me to Route 1. And notice now, it might be a bit difficult to see, but notice that it actually says /home in my window location. If I go to if I click on blog, it's going to take me to /blog, and then that changes without a refresh. And then about is going to take me to about, and that changes in the URL. But check this out. Now, if I go back in my browser, I go back to the browser, you can see that popstate event is being fired. So back to the blog, my popstate event is being fired. If I click back one more time, now I go to home, that's another popstate event. I can even go forward and trigger these. So if I go forward, that's back to blog, that's another popstate. If I go forward again, that's back to about. And you can see we can just go back, forward, back, forward. I can even change it through here, and I can render whatever it is that I need. So that is pretty darn awesome. There is no browser refreshing happening here. We are conditionally rendering different routes depending on what's actually happening in here with our routes. And then each of those routes has links, or in this case, our navbar has links that can translate between the different routes. And it actually can change not only the history API, so we can go back and forward correctly, but also the actual context, so everything is in sync. And we can make sure that every single route has access to the correct URL. So this path gets updated correctly for this context, or sorry, this current URL here gets updated with the correct context, and then we can match that to the path to actually decide to render these children or not. So that is a lot of stuff happening. I just want to recap everything from top to bottom, just so we can kind of have an overview of how we went building this application and a bit of the flow of data that we actually worked with. If we go over to our browser router, we said we wanted to create a context for this along with some states so that we could share it with everything inside of our routing tree. We are storing state for our URL, which is a URL object, so that we can have access to things like the href or the origin like we saw earlier, so that we can easily set different parts of the URL without having to parse strings. We then realized that we needed an API, which was the history API in this case right here, that allows us to actually manipulate the back and forward button states so that we can do things like listen for this popstate event and actually do things differently. In this case, sync up the URL with what's actually happening with the back and forward in the browser, because that browser functionality is not something that's easily exposed in HTML. We need our JavaScript to actually tell us that that event fired, and then we can react to it accordingly. So no pun intended. So that is exactly what's happening over here. We can probably then eventually get rid of this console log as well if we want, so we can comment that out. And that is going to handle everything along with the cleanup for that actual event and event handler, event listener. We only have one of these for our entire application. There's only one event handler no matter how many routes there are, which is a very, very nice kind of architecture to use. So that if we have thousands of routes, we are not having thousands of event handlers. We can just have that one event handler and it can react accordingly. Once we have our browser router done, we worked on our routes. The route was relatively simple. It just took a path and it used the context to match the current URL of the global state, in our case, to see if they match. And if it matched, it would render as children. Otherwise, it would not. And just to you remember, this is exactly what a route would look like, right? It would have a path being passed in as well as the children, and those children could be components themselves, and we would render them out correctly. The last step was a link. We needed a way to wrap an A tag so that it wouldn't try to reload the page, and we could actually hook into it the onClick event and actually do whatever we wanted with it. So in this case, we created a link with a to property, and the navigation does two things. When it's clicked, it pushes a new value onto the history stack so that we can actually go back and forward correctly. So that fixes any bugs with going back and forward. And then we actually sync up the global state to be that new value that we just pushed onto there so that it gets updated correctly for all the routes. And that's what's showing the re-rendering of the actual routes as we're clicking through these different values. So this is handling the re-rendering, and this is handling the actual browser's back and forward states to make sure that they're all in sync. Okay, oof, that was a lot. So hopefully that one makes sense, right? I encourage you to add more routes, play around with it, try different things, and refactor some of the code around. By no means is the code that we just wrote or that you watch me just write the kind of be all or end all. In fact, there might be a lot of bugs still in there. It's just the minimum viable kind of product to actually show you how you build a library like this yourself. As I mentioned before, here are a bunch of different stretch goals that you can go for. Now that this should make a bit more sense now that you've seen how everything works, you can add different things. Like we're not handling really the query parameters very well over here. You can probably see if you can handle those. Technically, we're handling them in like a very minimal way, but you want to be very careful with how you handle these query parameters, especially for nested routes. You'd want to see if you can handle the hashes I mentioned, if you can skip down on a page, if you click on it just like in a regular A tag, a 404 page. Try to add it into your own project and see how it works compared to a regular routing library like something like React Router DOM. But really, I hope that this was a technical enough challenge for you that now that you built something like this, you can probably see it's not actually that much code to get the most basic version of this actually lined up. What's challenging is all of the stuff that goes around this, like all the research you need to do, all the actual coding and testing, the debugging, and then actually figuring out how to hook these components together and make the state changes all flow correctly and the events flow correctly. That is really the challenging part. And that's very similar to how these types of things would work in the real world once you're working on a team or a larger project with a group, or even by yourself for a large project. You'll definitely run into exactly all these different things that I hope you had a chance to kind of plow through as you worked on this yourself. Okay, that was quite a lot. So I hope that you enjoyed this project and this video. If you did, I would love it if you could like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you liked the series and this content, you can support as well by going to the Patreon page or YouTube memberships or super thanks. What I will probably do is eventually I might make a secondary project where we can actually do some front end work, where we can do things like a Pokedex or something. But I really want this to be the main core project for capstone project really for this entire React course, because as I mentioned several times already, this type of thing is something that you can really talk to when you're demoing to other developers or things like interviews, or even for yourself. You can feel comfortable with things like context and the use state and the use effect. We use almost every single hook here. You could even add a reducer and add more functionality so you're using it that way. You could add things like a cache with a ref, or actually use things like this router state over here, right? And actually add more data into there and have it managed that way. There's so many things you can do. The sky's the limit. This entire series has been a total blast for me to actually put through together. I hope that, let me switch back to my big full view here. So I really hope that you enjoyed the entire React series. It was amazing putting the whole thing together from start to finish. There's quite a lot of content in there, and if you really were able to go from start to finish with all of that React content, I would say that you're pretty good to go, especially if you can do the exercises and projects like this. Try it out, explain this to other developers, and you'd be surprised how much you actually know when you actually really put yourself to the test, right? Like this is not trivial stuff, but it might seem that way when you're actually working on it eventually, because you've gone through so much up until this point, if you've been following along, that really there is a lot of knowledge now packed into your brain. What I would suggest is, if you're looking for things to do after this series, is you can look at the roadmap video that I have on the channel as well. I would encourage looking at things like how you'd actually build an API on the back end to start interacting with through your React application. It can be a simple JSON API, and you can build it up from there. But that would be probably one of the best next steps to do, so you can really do the traditional full stack kind of role, as up until now, everything we've been focusing on has been front end. If front end is your goal, at least in the short term, you can definitely go ahead and start building projects with this and using third-party APIs and building things out and really showing your chops. But I would encourage you as well to eventually start looking at things like the backend, and I'll be creating a series on those as well. So it was a total pleasure creating this series for all of you again. I hope that you enjoyed it and this project video as well. Until the next series, I will see you later.